Chapter 21 of J.S. Bach, Volume 2, Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. J.S. Bach, Volume 2, by Albert Schweitzer, translated by Ernest Neumann. Word and Tone in J.S. Bach, Part 3. Wagner maintained that Beethoven had a language of this kind. Quote, "In long connected stretches of sound," he says, "as in larger, smaller, or even the smallest fragments, it, that is, instrumental music, became in the poetic hands of Beethoven vowels, syllables, words and phrases of a language in which something hitherto unheard, unspeakable, and never yet spoken could find voice. Every letter of this language was an infinitely soulful element, and the measure of the joining of these elements was unlimited freedom of judgment. Und das Maß der Fügung dieser Elemente unbegrenzt freies Ermessen, as is possible only to the tone poet, who longs for immeasurable expression of the most unfathomable longing." End quote. Speaking of himself, Wagner says, with reference to the time when he was writing The Flying Dutchman, quote, "I had to acquire the capacity for musical expression in the same way as one learns a language. But now I had thoroughly learned the language of music. I was at home in it now as in a veritable mother tongue. When I had anything to say, I had no longer to trouble about the formal side of expression. It was at my command, just as I had need of it, to communicate a definite impression or feeling according to my inner impulse." End quote. On the other hand, he will not admit that Bach has developed a language. In Das Judentum in der Musik, he almost makes it a reproach against Mendelssohn that he's influenced by Bach. Quote, "Bach's musical language," he says, "was formed in a period of our musical history in which the general musical language was striving after the faculty of surer individual expression. It was still so hampered by formalism and pedantry that its purely human expression only managed to find utterance in Bach by reason of the abnormal strength of his genius. Bach's language bears the same relation to that of Mozart and that of Beethoven as the Egyptian Sphinx to the Greek statues of human beings, as the Sphinx with its human face strives to come out of the body of the animal, so Bach's noble human head strives to come out of the periwig." End quote. At the time when he pronounced this judgment, 1852, Wagner could not have known many of Bach's works, but even later, when he had looked into the cantatas, he clung to his opinion. From his standpoint, he could not admit Bach's musical language to be of equal value with that of Beethoven and his own, since it does not represent the play of successive emotional episodes, but only a definite emotion. Its strong bias towards the pictorial only strengthened his view that Bach could not free himself of the naive materialistic conception of music. If, however, we recognize poetic music and pictorial music as two equally legitimate basic styles of the art, we must not regard Bach's simple language of feelings and pictures as a primitive form that was surpassed by Beethoven and Wagner, but as the utterance of one particular kind of musical imagination. The nearest affinity to the musical language of Bach's cantatas is that of the accompaniments to Schubert's songs. These also make large use of pictorial associations. The unique thing in Bach is the clearness and completeness of the language. Its elements, being mostly of the pictorial order, can be much more exactly shown than those of Beethoven and Wagner. We can really speak of the roots and derivations of his language. Almost all the characteristic expressions that impress us by their regular recurrence in the cantatas and passions resolve themselves into about 20 to 25 root themes, mostly pictorial in origin. These well-defined groups comprise, for example, the already mentioned step motifs for the expression of firmness, indecision, or tottering, the syncopated themes of lassitude, the theme that depicts tumult, the graceful wavy lines that depict peaceful rest, the serpentine lines that contort themselves at the mention of the word Satan, the charming, flowing motifs that enter when angels are mentioned, the motifs of rapturous, naive, or passionate joy, the motifs of distressful or noble grief. No attempt is here made to give a schematic catalogue of Bach's themes. It's only intended to point out what any musician can easily verify for himself, that the wealth of Bach's musical language does not consist in any special multiplicity of themes and motifs, but in the manifold shadings by means of which a few general formulae are made to express characteristic ideas and feelings. If it were not for this interesting variety in the individual forms and formulae, Bach's tone language might almost be called monotonous. The establishment of a musical language in Bach is not a mere pastime for the aesthetician, but a necessity for the practical musician. It is often impossible to play a work of his in the right tempo, and with the right accent, and the right phrasing, unless we know the meaning of the motif. The simple feeling does not always suffice. The serious errors that even judicious commentators can commit when, without taking into consideration Bach's musical language as a whole, they try to explain pieces that call for elucidation, may be seen from Spita's remarks cited above upon the cantatas Brich dem Hungrigen, No. 39, and Es ist ein trotzig und verzagt Ding, No. 176. There is only one way to avoid falling into the fantastic, a comparative study of all the cantatas. They explain each other. No one can conduct one cantata properly unless he knows them all. Short explanations may be given to an audience if they're confined to simple hints as to Bach's method of musical characterization. They are objectionable when they are meant to induce the audience to regard the cantata in question as, quote, modern music, unquote. Unintelligent modernization of Bach is the greatest hindrance to the true understanding of his works. To the plain man, indeed, many explanations will seem fantastic that are not really so. This, however, is due to Bach himself, whose music is frequently extraordinarily audacious. Apart from that, there are certain movements in his works, the riddle of which will never be fully solved, and the elucidation of which will always be somewhat arbitrary. Very often, however, a musical picture that has been regarded as undecipherable is suddenly explained by an analogous picture that we've come across by hazard in another cantata. The understanding of Bach's musical language is also valuable for the interpretation of the purely instrumental works. Many pieces in the well-tempered clavichord, in the violin sonatas, or in the Brandenburg concertos, speak quite definitely to us, as it were, when the meaning of their themes is explained by the text that accompanies similar themes in the cantatas. Two objections may be raised to the assumption of a complete musical language in Bach: that he occasionally parodied his own works in a really thoughtless way, and that so far as we know he never said anything either to his pupils or to his sons with reference to his pictorial purposes. Both objections are unanswerable from the historical standpoint. On the other hand, they cannot invalidate the facts, as revealed to us in the scores. They only make us ask to what degree Bach was conscious of his musical language being a means of expression peculiar to himself, and the result of profound artistic reflection. But to this question, again, no definite answer is possible, for it is even more difficult to fix upon the borderline between the conscious and the unconscious in the case of Bach than in that of any other genius. His musical language is so clear, and makes so deep an impression, that we cannot but regard it as deliberate. Unlike Wagner, Bach never felt the necessity of explaining his own mental processes, either to himself or to others. A psychological common denominator between the two cases will probably never be found. Nor can much be said upon the origin and development of Bach's musical language. in the chorale partitas of the Arnstadt and Mühlhausen period, certain poetic ideas are already thrown into high relief in the music. This is especially the case with the last strophes of O Gott, du frommer Gott, Peters 5:68 and forward. The 7th verse speaks of death and burial, a wonderful melodic line, similar to one found in the cantata Ich steh mit einem Fuß im Grabe, number 156, and elsewhere, depicts the descent into the kingdom of the dead. The 8th verse speaks of the sleeping soul's expectation of the resurrection. Bach conceives it as a painful longing, and so writes a number of variations upon the chromatic motif, which he had already employed in the Lamento of the Capriccio, and which is so often met with afterwards in his music. In the final variation, the risen souls break out into a jubilant song of praise of the Trinity. In the course of it, we have one of Bach's most characteristic rhythms, that of tranquil happiness. In other works of his youthful period, we find poetic ideas expressed in a more or less definite way. In the first part of a chorale prelude upon Jesus meine Freude, Peters 6, number 29, we first of all get a picture of the feverish unrest of the world that leads the anxious soul to seek out Jesus. At the words Gottes Lamm, mein Bräutigam, it has found him. A wonderful dolce in 3/8 time depicts its rapture. A fantasia on the Easter chorale, Christ lag in Todesbanden, 6, number 15, begins with heavy descending semiquavers that seem to fetter the melody and draw it down into the depths. At the words, Des sollen wir fröhlich sein, let us be joyful, the music brightens, flowing along in a delightful triplet movement, Peters 6, page 41, and ending in an impetuous song of triumph. These experiments, however, are not pursued tentatively for any long period. The musical language appears complete and perfect at once. Its first document is the chorales of the Orgelbewegung, Peters 5. This collection contains such improvisations of the Weimar period as he thought worth preserving. The title that Bach gave this work, of which he afterwards made a clean copy at Köthen, is sufficient to show the treasures of musical poetry that it contains. The works themselves confirm this impression. They represent a particular type of chorale prelude. They originate in the simple melody itself, which is supported by a motif treated in thorough contrapuntal style. This motif contains the idea of the poem. It is, in a manner, the poetic illustration of the melody, and here we can detect the motifs Bach uses in order to express pictures and emotions in music. These 45 chorales are the dictionary of his musical language, the key to the understanding of his music as a whole. When Bach planned this collection, he would be about 30 years old. From this time until his death, he does not swerve in the slightest degree either from his poetic conception of music or from the musical language in which he had found expression for his ideas. The language of the cantatas is the same as that of the Orgelbewegung. One change is indeed noticeable as time goes on. The pictorial quality of his thinking becomes more and more evident. In the earlier works, it is still kept under, to some extent, by the melodic interest. Later on, it asserts itself irresistibly. In the end, Bach writes themes that are strikingly characteristic in themselves, but are not quite grateful to the ear. The great chorale fantasias, Jesus Christus unser Heiland, Peters 6, number 30, and Christ unser Herr zum Jordan kam, Peters 6, number 17, for example, almost overpass the borderline of music that is meant to appeal to the ear. Again, in the affecting cantata Ich glaube, lieber Herr, hilf meinem Unglauben, number 109, in which Bach depicts wavering faith, we have the impression that the pictorial bias is too prominent in the music. Here we are bound to think Bach wrong. He has ventured beyond the natural limits of music. His mistake, however, has nothing in common with that of the naive practitioners of tone painting. They fail because they mistake the nature of music. He fails because he cultivates to its final consequences the language in which he expresses himself so consummately, with the result that for the ordinary intelligence, the melodic and the beautiful are almost wholly lost in the plastic. It is an error of which only genius is capable. End of section 7, chapter 21, part 3. Read by Sandra near Montreal, 2021.